So we are doing a something of the Hack and Learn event. As you might remember, we had 3 challenges that we will present today. This is the work that people who were involved in the Hack and Learn did over a period of 2 weeks. So this is really fast-paced, and those are prototypes, but often we take those forward. So okay. Those are the 3 challenges that we had. The first one was how much does it cost? That was led by Sri and Juliana. Then we had a challenge on understanding measurement in impact bonds, which was led by Priyanshu from the Indian Institute of Management. And the last challenge was rethinking the outcome metric variable, led by our colleagues at INSPER, Georgie. We had a spontaneous 4th challenge that emerged that we will talk about later. Next slide, please. Oh, Puli.
I think we can stay for now, so I think I can present the challenge.
Go for it.
Great. So I will be presenting. Oh, okay. Well, I'm really sorry, but I can't present it. So I will take my computer and the slides, and I will go with Priyanshu, and I will make sure that he has his slides here.
Wonderful, Priyanshu. The way these show and tell usually work is that the challenge leader presents a few slides to tell us the story of the progress they made and give us some highlights. And then we have Abik, who is who kindly agreed to give some feedback on what seems helpful, more promising, and potential suggestion for improvement. Priyanshu, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. My apologies, my video doesn't seem to be working today for some reason, so you'll have to bear with me. Right? So if you can just put the pointer. Yeah. So our challenge largely focused on understanding the measurement framework associated with impact bonds. And as is obvious, measurement is really one of the most crucial design elements in the impact bond structure. One, because the financial rewards are obviously tied to the service delivery outcomes in this mechanism. Secondly, it is also crucial to validate whether the program has actually been able to achieve its intended outcomes and hopefully test the theory of change, which should provide insights into future design elements. So with this objective, we started off trying to understand what the measurement framework being used in the current set of impact bonds. Next slide. So we largely focus on 3 elements of the measurement framework. First is the choice of metric. So what kind of outcome metrics are being used? How many metrics are being used? And even though we call most metrics as outcome metrics, but in a sense, sometimes we are also measuring outputs or intermediate outcomes or activities or a combination of these. So what is the format of these metrics that we are trying to use? The second element of the measurement framework is the evaluation method that is used to capture and track this metric, where we were basically trying to understand, are we using more simpler and easier to track methods like administrative data or maybe say surveys, or are majority of the bonds using the more complex and robust and obviously more expensive methods like experimental, quasi-experimental RCTs, etc. The third element was what is the payment structure that is tied to the metric. So what triggers the outcomes? Is it based on a per capita basis? Is it based on a binary basis where a certain minimum number of percentage of population has to achieve the outcomes? Or is it on distance travel basis where every participant undergoes a significant amount of change? So this is what we really try to do in this challenge. Next slide. And we focused only on the metrics that was linked to payments. We ignored all the other metrics that may not have triggered payments, right? So how we went about this, Kubashi, if you're there, do you want to take?
Yeah, sure, sir. Hi everyone, I'm Kavaishi and I've been part of Challenge 29. So in this challenge, we were able to work with 86 bonds out of the 270 odd bonds. And we've gone ahead with the analysis to see what kind of insights we get. Mainly, we focused on three sectors: employment and training, criminal justice, and education. So how we went about this was in three steps. First, we created three new variables, as Sir has mentioned: metric, payment structure, and the evaluation mode. Next slide, please. So then after a healthy debate, we agreed on some coding guidelines, which helped us to populate the three columns we had created. And next. Lastly, we analyzed and explored all the data which we had populated with preliminary insights from many people we had. So thank you. That was from my side. Further is explained
Over
in
to Ubang.
many slides.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So as you can see on the previous slides, it was more of a team effort, and we really, appreciate everyone giving their inputs. So we'll start with what we found. So we'll start with, the variance which we observed in the number of metrics that are tied to outcome payments. For some, we found 2 or fewer, but in some we had, around 8 to 10 metrics as well. So this chart is basically, trying to find that relation between, how many metrics are there for which particular category. So as it was highlighted, we did for 3: education, criminal justice, and employment and training. So this is basically what we're trying to focus in this chart. As can be seen, the maximum we found were 19 metrics, which was used in a bond in employment and training sector, which was from United Kingdoms. So yeah, I believe we can move to the next slide, please. Okay. So for this one, it's more about which metric was for triggering payments. So we had output. So as highlighted, it was highlighted, we had 4: activity, output, outcome, and we also did have a combination as well. Now again, as we can see over here, sorry, please excuse me, as we can see over here, a significant chunk is based on the outcome. Now again, between output and outcome, this we've highlighted in the learnings as well, but we've tried to have this understanding at our end. Is output is something which we get right off the bat when the bond has been completed, whereas outcome is something which is more on a timely manner, which we get after say a particular period of time. So that is the basic understanding that we have kept for now within ourselves for output and outcome, because again, we'll cover this in learnings as well. There is still some clarity which is required on this aspect as well. So if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. Again, for payment structure as well, we found there were few bonds which had mixed payment structures, whereas few had solely per capita. But as can be seen here, majority of them did follow per capita method for, or payment triggers for their bonds. Again, even in this, we have some learnings which we'll cover in the later stages. But distance traveled methods, are also used in many bonds, which is then followed by binary. So again, in distance traveled, we had 2, which was per capita and by the entire beneficiary population. So again, for the entire beneficiary population holds a major chunk, which was 21.7%, whereas distance traveled per capita was just 2.4%. And you can see a term called as unclear. So this is where we had that we hope that we had more clarity on it. which we can discuss in further slides because we have that covered. But that is what unclear stands for, just for reference purpose. So yeah, next slide, please. Okay. So now moving on. Okay. This is for the mode by which we are evaluating it. So again, as can be seen, administrative mode is really a bigger factor here. For about 47% of the bonds, we found that, or rather 47% of the metrics were evaluated based on the administrative data. On the other hand, survey was the least method used, and nearly 1/3 used the RCTs, or experimental or quasi experimental design data metric to have, or rather evaluate the metrics that we have. I'm sorry, is my voice clearly audible? Because I'm getting an error at my end, I'm not sure.
It is very clear, thank you.
Okay, thank you for confirming. Again, moving forward, this is more of a payment structure versus evaluation mode. We try to get we try to map out how much is the linkage between these two metrics. Again, as can be highlighted, distance travel for population is dependent on RCT, because again, we need a control reference for the population, and as can be seen, the number is quite high for payment structure, which is per capita, and evaluation mode, which is administrative data. So yeah, that's basically the key highlight of this slide. But again, we've tried to, again, thanks to Nilima ma'am, that we've tried to get this data and make some analysis out of it. So yeah, can move to the next slide, please. Again, a similar chart, but based on the evaluation mode and the metrics about what triggers the payment. So again, as can be seen, we have about 129 output. Now this is the data is aggregated for all the three verticals that we discussed previously, all the three types, rather, I should say. So this data represents the aggregate for all of that. Yeah, I think a similar table. So we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so over here, what we tried to do is we calculated how much data is unclear for a specific bond, or rather for a specific metric, for all the metrics available for that particular country. Again, just to clarify it further, for example, we'll consider Japan. Now, the first one, which is for the payment structure, we found that, again, 100% data was unclear. Now, this number was reflected because in Japan, we found only one bond was available, and that one bond did not have clarity in the data. So that is why this came up to 100%. Whereas now when we go for evaluation mode, we see that South Korea has the highest percentage of unclear data for all the bonds that are available within South Korea. But again, over here, the count was very low. It was just 2 bonds which was available in South Korea. But the number of bonds were considerable in size for USA, UK, Portugal, and Netherlands. So if we see for them, for considering the payment structure, for USA, we had around 30%, or we can consider 31% of data, which was unclear for the payment structure for the bonds which are available in USA. And the next one is, if we consider New Zealand, we had 33%. For Netherlands, for the payment structure, we just had 11.11%. But if the same we move for the evaluation mode, again, Portugal, we had 25% data, which was unclear for the evaluation mode, and so on and so forth. So we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So again, a few of
Can I give you 2 minutes to wrap up, to allow time to other challenge leaders too, please?
Sure.
Thank
Sure.
you.
We'll quickly continue. Thank you for that. So I'll quickly cover what we learned. So the data quality which was used, or the data as we just showed, there are unclear data for some of the countries, and we have clear representation of data for some other. Again, for some geographies, we found that the output metric, or rather the payment metrics, were not that robust, because we found combination of both per capita as well as binary. So that is where, we believe that if we had a relatively drop down, wherein we can further, dig deep into, maybe in future we can dig deep and we can clarify it further, classify it further, it would be more helpful. The third point is difficult to accurately classify output and outcome. Again, as I highlighted initially, what was our mindset on what we decide what output and outcome is, but there is no specific, clarification which we found. So it is more subjective. Again, data on evaluation methods were not readily available. We did not find many fact sheets. We had to, go on secondary research, and even then not all the data were obtained. There were a few bonds for which we found no data online. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Yep. Again, very similar, difficult to infer payment structures. Second point is the same, most bonds are available, but no data was available online. So we did not find any data on them. Again, I believe no explicit mention on metric category, payment type, and evaluation mode. It had to be inferred, so more clarity required over there as well. And further subcategorization of metrics would help get better clarity on having this data understood better and maybe analyze it better. So that's the learning part. If you can move to the next slide, please.
Yes, where does this leave us? So we've done very preliminary analysis based on just 86 of the entire population set. But even here, we seem to be finding some useful insights which can potentially be looked at in future. And in this project, we only asked about what question, what is happening, but this can hopefully potentially inform why and how questions, right? So why is some type of measurement framework prevalent in some countries and in some sectors? What factors drive the choice of different payment structures, etc. And that, right? So if you could just move on. Yeah, so building on this project, we can hopefully try to ask in future, are the metrics, payment structures, and evaluation methods befitting to track the theory of change or the intended objectives of the development intervention? Right. So that's largely it from our side. Thank you so much for joining in and supporting all the work. Happy to take feedback and questions.
Thank you so much, everyone, for representing the work of this challenge. Very, very interesting. I'm inviting Abik Sen, who agreed to provide some feedback. Abik is the head of innovation and partnership at the Commonwealth Secretariat, which is an intergovernmental organization. And he's leading the innovation and partnership development with governments, international development organizations, and other stakeholders towards the achievement of the SDGs. In particular, one of his projects is the Commonwealth Innovation Hub, which is a peer-to-peer knowledge sharing and data analysis platform that provides policy advice and capacity building assistance to government in the Commonwealth. So I think he's using platform and trying to use insight to inform decisions. Abik, can you share your feedback on this challenge, please? You're muted. We could hear you before. Okay. Felix, can I come to you while Abik sorts out his, you are muted to me, Abik. You really look muted.
Can we unmute ourselves?
I think we can.
From
Shri, can you see if you can unmute Abik centrally? No, you know what is the problem. So maybe Felix, can I come to you for some feedback, and we'll come back to you a bit. Feel free to unmute and see if you can speak. Yes, we'll wait for you. Okay, okay, Felix.
I think this was a really interesting presentation. And I think what I find, and I think I'll start with the last bits, because I think this was for me the most interesting. But the last slide that showed the questions of why and where. I think one thing that would be interesting would be to have some longitudinal data in the future to see how metrics design changes over time. I think that'd be really interesting to see how this develops. And in terms of the why, that's one of the questions that I'm dealing with at the moment, is whether you have in different jurisdictions different types of requirements or different perhaps cultures for accountability, for instance. So when you look, it would be interesting to see whether whether you find in some jurisdictions a prevalence for more kind of more tightly defined metrics or more output style metrics vis-a-vis other countries where you have broader defined outcomes, and whether you see patterns there. Because it seems to me that particularly in England, for instance, you have much tighter accountability requirements where you might call something an outcome, but where you then start defining things a little bit more tightly than originally planned. So this is one of the observations that I had, which I think would be really interesting to look into.
Thank you, Felix. I'm just checking if Abik is back. And sorry, I didn't introduce you, Felix. Felix is a postdoc researcher here at the GoLab, and his expertise is to investigate new approaches to better organize public service delivery. He's a legal scholar by background, but I remember when we interviewed him, he presented a paper on artificial intelligence, so a very eclectic type of researcher. Abik, welcome back.
Thank you so much, and my apologies for the little, IT never sort of leaves us alone. But thank you so much, firstly, for that really like eye-opening presentation and the research behind it. As Mara was saying earlier, my work is essentially all about seeing how we can introduce all types of innovation, including innovative financing, to some of our more developing countries in the Commonwealth. And I appreciate that sort of the presentation was based around looking at things that are happening in, I would say, mostly like sort of industrialized countries. So my question really, and firstly my kind of reflection on it was that obviously this is if it all works well, then obviously the outcomes for a society or a country are hugely beneficial. So it would be helpful if the researchers are able to, in a sense, summarize what perhaps some of the gains have been for the countries where you're able to see the full cycle for one or more of these bonds. And a question or two for them is, you mentioned a bit about sort of the I suppose the unevenness of the data on which the research is predicated. So is it really a prerequisite to have a very good quality and quantity of all sorts of data, starting with administrative data, before a country can even consider impact bonds as an option? Secondly, what has been in the case studies that we were looking at, if you're able to sort of highlight what the role of the government has been in any of these things, especially the national government, and if not the national, then local or provincial government. And my last question is whether there are any examples of successful impact bonds in India itself, where I know the the project team is based, and so hopefully they have some if not research-based, at least some anecdotal information to share on that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhi. I think this is really interesting comments. Priyanshu, I don't know if you have one minute, we're running behind to respond to one of those, and then you can, I think the team can respond on the chat before I pass on to Shri, who I think is back for the cost challenge. Priyanshu, you want to share your 1 minute?
Sure. Just super thankful for all the questions and the comments. This is good feedback for future work. On the longitudinal data side, we tried seeing, but we were not able to see clear trends on the limited set that we were working with. Difference in cultures of accountability in jurisdiction is a very, very interesting dynamic to look at. I think that relates also to Abhi's feedback on what the role of the government has been, what the role of society has been, and all of those kind of things. Right? The case from India, yes, I think we've had a few transactions, roughly four impact bonds and about 10-11 outcome-based contracts, and so far all have been very successful, very impactful, and all of that. But what was also striking is that it seems to be more complicated and robust measurement frameworks being used in India, whereas in some of the more industrialized countries, we're seeing more administrative data, and that talks about the maturity of the data systems or the data culture in these geographies, perhaps, which gives confidence. So that's my preliminary reaction. But yeah, thank you so much for your feedback.
Priyanshu. In the interest of time, I'll pass it to Shri and Juliana, who are now safely back despite the alarm.
Great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mara. And just so everybody is sure, we are all fine here. The fire alarm is over. And that was fun, but we are back. And I'm going to share my screen again. And the next one in line is challenge number 29. And I think this is Georgie's challenge, the one around metrics, system level metrics and individual metrics. Are you there, Georgie?
Yeah, I'm here. So
great.
So I'll present what we have for our challenge. The main idea here was trying to adapt the data model to capture different types of outcome metrics. So it was a conceptual challenge, and the main idea here was to think about our data model and to analyze how many contracts do we have considering outcome metrics at system level metrics, and then to give some ideas of improvements in our data model. So next, please. So to make it more clear, we have some individual level metrics just to highlight and give some examples. For instance, sustainment of accommodation for 6 months for homeless, education opportunities, and entry into employment for individuals. And next, please. And we also have some system level metrics. For instance, number of companies that employ participants of a program, or aggregate learnings gains for a group of students. So these are two different kind of level of metrics: individual level metrics and some system level metrics. So just we start our challenge making an analysis about considering the Indigo's impact bond database. So we pick up 100 contracts to have an idea about how important, how many contracts do we have system level metrics. And analyzing 100 contracts, we have that 37% of them have at least one system level metrics. So it's an important kind of metric that the model should take into account. So next, please. And then we have our main suggestions. We have 3 suggestions related to existing columns already in the model. So the main idea is try to standardize the information that are in some columns, try to get more data. So we will diminish the number of missing data in some points, and the inclusion of a new option in one of the columns. And finally, we will suggest some additional columns, and then we will have an idea. So the first one is that they standardize the information. So one of the columns called outcome definition value. So we have very different, so we have some projects providing a lot of information, and that's great. And we have other projects that provide a more concise information. So it would be very nice if we had what are the main information that we should add in this outcome definition value column. So we could have a pattern to all the projects to include in this indicator. So next, please. So the second one is that another column that is very important here in our database is the outcome metric target. So here is one of the columns that we would have many information about, for instance, how would be triggered the payment for the result. But in many cases, we have missing data in this column. So if we have more data on that, it would be very good. It would be very nice. Finally, another one, please. One column that we do believe that it would be simple is the inclusion of an additional point at this column unit type of target service. So we just have individual and other in our code list. So we could add system level metrics that would be very nice, and it would be great to have this. So next, please. Finally, we would suggest the addition of 2 columns. The first one is a classification about if that metric have public available data or not. Why this is important? Because, for instance, if we are analyzing how data is important at a project level, we could see, for instance, if the government or if we have publicly available data, it would be easier to launch a SIB in that field, because it would be a concern less related to data collection. And if the public information is available, another column, what's the source of this information? So it would be very nice to have this information. So that's it. Thank you very much. And all the team for the great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. I will pass it on to Felix now, and then to Avik, if he's still here, to say a few words about this challenge and to share their main insights. And we are running a bit behind, so I will ask Felix and Avik to be short, and we can keep posting questions and comments on the chat.
Yeah, I think this is a brilliant challenge. I know that the question of system level change is a big one also for central government. One question that I had was the same that Elle basically already put in the chat. It's extremely hard, I think, for government also to kind of define what system level change is and how to measure that. So I think there's quite a lot of work to be done how to measure system level change. Then I think what would be really interesting to see also is this question of the relationship between system and individual level metrics, because you can say we're going to have really good individual level outcomes metrics, and we will trust that if in order to achieve those, you will have to instill some sort of system change, but we don't care about what the system is going to look like in the end, as long as it provides the change for the individual. I think this is happening, for instance, in the project that we've been evaluating in K-pop, for instance, where you see system level changes, but on the basis of individual metrics. And the other way around basically is self-explanatory, whether there is a causal relationship between these two. So this would be interesting to me.
Thanks, Felix. Avik, do you have any questions or any comments to share?
Yeah, thanks, Juliana. I'll just echo, I think, what Felix said, but perhaps in a slightly different way, which is that I mean, yeah, there is so much talk around systems thinking, systems level transformation, wherever you go these days. But it's very hard to pin it down. Like, what do you mean by this, right? Like, especially if you're talking about indicators, can you actually come up with indicators that are universal rather than sort of context specific, right? Because I mean, we see this problem with in terms of measuring SDGs around the world, right? And increasingly with sort of climate commitments. And when you ask somebody sort of what do you mean by like a systems level indicator, it's often a similar situation when you ask somebody like, so we keep talking about woke this, woke that. What do you actually mean by woke? And then people fumble and like nobody has a clear answer, right? And everybody's answer is different. So I think before we kind of get into the technicalities of these things, I think there has to be perhaps a more at a higher level, some discussion, dialogue, and debates around what do we mean by all these terms, and then kind of coming up with the frameworks, because otherwise it's like this seems to me like another sort of another tool to kind of widen some of the divisions that kind of are there in the world. So I'll just stop there. But overall, it is kind of, it's a great sort of starter for 10, if you like.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen again. And I think the next one is James. James used the time in our Hack and Learn event to help us, giving us technical assistance. And on top of that, he did what he called the one-person challenge. And he worked on trying to link the Indigo organizations IDs to other type of IDs databases out there. And he's trying to do that. And he will tell us what he did, how he did it. And we're going to see if we can do it in a bigger scale. So now it's
yes, hello.
The floor is yours.
Cool, thank you. So I'm James from Open Data Services Co-op. I want to talk about discovering more information about projects. Next slide, please. So other data standards may have data we are interested in. So for example, the 360 Giving Data Standard is a standard that has lots of data in the UK on various charitable grants that are given. Open Contracting and Partnership is an international data standard that has lots of data on tender processes when a government contracts to a private company. And if an impact bond, an Indigo project, is the subject of a grant or a tender process, there may be interesting information there that we can use to help research the Indigo project. Next slide, please. But the problem is, how do we find this information? Because all these data sets are different and they aren't linked up. Next slide, please. So just to recap, the Indigo data model has separate entities for a project and an organization can have multiple roles in a project. Next slide. Another advantage of this is that we can reuse information, because one organization like Sheffield Futures may be involved in multiple projects. And rather than making people type the same information in twice, we can have one record for the organization, which is reused. And any improvements we can make to that record and any data we can find will be linked to all the projects which are relevant. Next slide. So In each of these data standards, there are organizations. So in Indigo, we have organizations, open contracting and 360 giving also has data records about organizations. So can we find Sheffield futures in this data? Next slide. Well, one of the problems, unfortunately, is that organizations often tend to be named slightly differently in different data sets. So the same organization would have slightly different names. Next slide. And this is a real problem. There was a recent report about the IATI data standard data set, and they found 7 different ways that the United Nations Refugee Agency was named in the one data set. And so that makes it very hard to say that that's actually the same organization and find links. Next slide, please. So how can we identify these organizations? Well, it turns out that many organizations already have IDs from different places. So for example, this is the website of Sheffield Futures, and you can see down in the footer that they are a charity registered in England and Wales, and they have a charity number, and they're also a company registered in England and Wales, and they have a company number. Next slide, please. So we can identify Sheffield Futures by the list it's on and its ID. So we can say Great Britain Companies House and the company's number, and we can say Great Britain Charities Commission and the charity number, and that will identify Sheffield Futures. So next slide, please. So the question is, where do we get these list IDs from, or information about these lists of organizations? So we run a website, OrgID Guide. You can select the type of organization you're looking for, and it will suggest places for you to look up details on that organization. So you see you have Companies House there, GBCOH, and just down the bottom right was the Charities Commission, GBCHC. So that's a standard place to look up information on the lists and get the codes. Next slide, please. And now, because all these different data standards use OrgID, we can link up the organizations in the data. So even though the names are slightly different, the IDs are the same, and we can say with certainty that those are the same organizations in different data sets. Next slide, please. So, but back to our problem of finding data across these data sets, how does having comparable organization IDs help with that? Next slide, please. So the first step is to go through the Indigo dataset on organizations and add org IDs to that. So we've added the org IDs for Sheffield Futures to the dataset. The next slide, please. And then at Open Data Services, we've been working on an experimental idea, an app to pull together, basically to get all the data from the datasets that we can and pull out all the references to org IDs and makes it easy to see where they're used. So that's the charity number for Sheffield Futures. And you can see that as well as being used in the Indigo dataset, if you go back, sorry, it's also used in 9 other places in the 360 giving dataset. So Sheffield Futures has been given 9 grants, and we can find information about that. Next slide, please. And so the last step is get this other data and show it to the editors automatically. And I want to highlight that we're talking about data about for projects because we've talked about the organizations a lot because they're the pin that sort of holds things together and lets us find this information. But we're talking about information which may be of interest to the Indigo projects. So on the left, you have some data from open contracting, and it includes the details of the tenders, dates, amounts. If that tender is part of a impact bond, maybe some interesting stuff there. On the right, we can see one of the grants that Sheffield Futures has got from the Department of Health. And again, we can see details on that grant and what it's for. And if that grant is involved in an impact bond, there may be interesting information there that we want to study. Next slide. So in this Hack and Learn, we added org IDs to some Indigo organizations as examples. We wrote up some notes on how to research IDs. We fed back some improvements we can make to the organizational data model that we realized when we were doing that. I also looked at and cleaned up some open contracting data that was found in previous Hack and Learns and fed back some improvements on the data model that we could do there as well. And then finally working on the project, which is that pulls together all IDs and multiple data standards and makes it easy to find links. Last slide, please. So in summary, other data standards also have information on projects which may be useful to the Indigo dataset. It can be difficult to find this information, but Indigo and all these other data standards all use org IDs to identify an organization. So let's add org IDs to Indigo organizations and then work on systems to automatically find that extra data and show it to editors. Thank you.
Great, thanks, James. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and again, we'll pass it on to Felix and Abix. And again, I'm going to ask you to be short because we are running a bit behind.
Okay.
Thanks.
Go
Yeah,
for it,
Abhi,
please.
yeah, you go.
Okay, so that was great. Really, really eye-opening, as I just saw on the chat. Two quick ones. So how does both sort of the Sheffield Futures is kind of work, but also I think Indigo more broadly, how do they score against sort of what are considered sort of open data principles or standards in general? And secondly, is there room for like sort of having APIs for some of these things so that others can also plug into this and kind of perhaps build out other social innovations around these data sets? Thank you.
Yeah, very similar comments. I think it's an extremely helpful project. We did actually something similar, or I think it would be interesting to connect that to the Sirocco dataset that we did, where we extracted entities from a large number of academic articles, but we did that via natural language processing models and not via such a kind of ID system. So I would be interested in understanding a little bit more how widespread this ID kind of marking organizations with IDs is, whether you have that for international organizations as well, whether it works internationally, and whether you have government institutions there as well, because there are a couple of we have a wide set of organizations that we extracted from that data set, and I think it would be really helpful to add these things to the Sirocco data set as well.
Great, thanks, Felix. And we have only 8 minutes, and I will try to be very fast, and I will try to show you something around the cost challenge. I will ask Sri to share his screen. Thank you very much. And I will go very fast because I don't want this challenge to be unseen. And I will ask James and Nelima to answer the questions on the chat because I think you received some very interesting comments and questions. Challenge number 28, it was titled, How much does it cost? And it was a continuation of challenge number 24, which is a challenge from the past Hack and Learn. If we go to the next slide, we will see that during our past Hack and Learn, we developed a new part of our data model or a new structure to host data on the cost of running an impact bond model. We decided to have 2 different tabs. There was one for the outcome payer cost and another one for the service payer or the investor cost. The challenge for this time was to populate this spreadsheet. This was more or less a test, a usability test. We wanted to see how well these variables worked if we wanted to get some data from some reports or some press releases or some news pieces, anything that has some data on cost. We wanted to see if this spreadsheet could capture it. We go to the next slide. We will see a bit of our work plan. We divided our work plan in 3 phases. So the first one was checking data availability on impact bond projects costs. The second one was using that data to populate the impact bond dataset spreadsheet. And the third one was to reflect on the spreadsheet usability and the challenges around cost and next steps of the project. If we go to the next slide, we will see 3 different clusters of findings. So we have findings from our stage number 1, which is data availability. And we realized that raw data on cost is not widely available. And I highlighted here raw data because we have seen more and more reports on impact bond projects and value for money or impact bond projects and cost benefit analysis. So we actually see many analyses and insights around the cost of these instruments. It was a bit difficult to find the raw data. If we go to the next slide, please. We will see the findings for the stage number 2, which is actually completing the spreadsheet. We did this live. Carolina and Fernando from INSPIR tried to complete some spreadsheet. Shri and I also did some spreadsheet work, and we have some conclusions on what are the things that we need to tweak or adapt in the next days. We go to the next slide. We concluded that there are many things to fix on the spreadsheet, mainly dates and cost phases and classifications. And this is because we were expecting much more granularity, and this is something that we actually can't achieve. If we go to the next one, we will see that it's difficult to handle ranges and approximate numbers. So sometimes, for example, if you see here on this table, someone reported that the external advice on legal and financial aspects of a contract was more than 50,000. And this is something difficult to handle for us if it is not a round number. If we go to the next one, we will see that it was also tricky to handle categories that don't match. It is usual for people to think of impact bond models in different stages. So we decided to have development and design, contract setup, and operational management. But you see here that there are other researchers thinking of 4 different stages: search, negotiation, monitoring, and enforcement. We're all speaking of the same things, but using different categories. So maybe this is also something that we could standardize in the future. If we go to the next slide, this is also something that we received as good feedback. The data dictionary should include a how to populate the spreadsheet guide, because the people who were part of Challenge 24 find it very easy to complete the spreadsheet because they were part of the development of the variables, but people who didn't have a previous background on the impact bond data set or this challenge found it very difficult to do it on their own. Those are our findings from stage number 2. And if we go to the next slide, we will see the findings from stage number 3, this is a summary of our reflections about releasing data on costs. And I just want to say that we had lots of very interesting and complex conversations around this topic. This is no easy topic, so I hope that I did justice to the conversation on these slides. So acknowledging the sensitivity of this data, we really need to be clear about the why and the what for of this data, why we publish this data, why we share this data, and what is for, because that will inform the rest of the analysis. The next slide shows finding number 2. A good analysis should consider cost and other important variables. Doing a cost analysis just for the sake of doing a cost analysis may not be very meaningful, but analyzing cost and analyzing outcome achievement and analyzing other variables such as the outcome payments or the total investment commitment, that may be a more meaningful analysis. If we go to the next slide, we also identify some issues with comparability. As we don't know how those numbers were produced, we are not sure if these numbers are actually comparable. So we're not sure if we can compare costs across projects yet. The next slide shows another finding. We know that it's easier to identify specific costs when there was a contract for this compared to when the functions are performed in-house. So basically, in-house costs, staff cost, or cost of work that was done on pro bono basis is very difficult to measure and was not very easy to capture with our spreadsheet. The next slide is our final finding. We really need to be careful when extracting data from reports, as those reports were written with a specific goal in mind. We used a lot an FCDO report, and we were relying on that data, but then we realized that that data was presented in a very specific way because they were trying to show the difference between running a service with an impact bond model and running a service with a traditional grant. So that there are some nuances and some clarifications that need to be made before using and reusing data. My final slide is a bonus. And we have only 2 minutes for the bonus, but I'm sure that Andrew can do it in 2 minutes. We were also thinking how to use this data and what to use it for. And we thought that one good use would be to compare it to the cost of running other type of public service under a traditional commissioning mechanism. We're not there yet. We don't have a model to host data on other public services that are not an outcomes contract, but we gave it a go. And we asked the question, is it possible to compare the cost of a SIBS to the cost of a similar public service under a different commissioning mechanism? And if we go to the next slide, we will see an exploratory table that Andrew prepared, and he will share it with us now in 2 minutes or less. Are you there, Andrew?
Hi, Diana. Yeah. So we looked at a sort of rate card style SIB project launched by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Governments. And that's where the money came from. And then the procurement and the management was done locally. And so we went and asked both, staff in both organizations, what were the transaction costs of doing this? And initially they said that there weren't any. And so when we dug a bit deeper, what they meant by that is they they hadn't paid any external organizations to do anything. So it had all been done within their normal kind of design and contracting teams. But that wasn't very useful. So then we said, well, can we try and look at, even if you didn't spend any money on this, can we look at how much time you spent on it? Because that you must have spent some time sort of launching this project. Every project requires some time. And so we went through the 4 main areas that Juliana listed: search, negotiation, and then the other 2, and tried to just get people to think about, okay, how much time did you spend on each of these different things? And can you compare that to the amount of time that you spent on the more traditional projects that you launched around the same time? And that produced slightly more useful information, because they were able to look at those individual things and sort of compare where there was more time spent or where there was less time spent compared to a traditional contract. So that, yeah, they're not really able to put costs on it because they don't know the cost of their own time, but they are able to sort of compare at each of those different categories, whether they thought something was more time consuming or less time consuming than the traditional way of procuring public services. So it felt like a reasonably interesting starting point to look at transaction costs of a certain type of SIB.
Thank you. Thank you, Shri, for sharing the slides. I know we are at time, so I completely understand if someone needs to go to another meeting or to somewhere else. I will just pass it on to Felix and Avik to see if they can share some feedback for this final challenge. And then we will go, but I will make sure to share the feedback that you share here with the group on the Slack channel and start a conversation on how to move on with this project.
I think this time I'll let Felix go first.
I would just want to offer you to go first. I don't have a whole lot to say about this other than I think it's super important. And I think there are a couple of strands in the Go Lab where we are going to look at these questions of transaction cost economics. And what I'm particularly interested in would be to look at and how far, if there are higher costs involved in, say, negotiating SIBS at the beginning, whether what the savings are on the other side, whether you can see anything along those lines. But that's something more for the economists in our team to do than for me as a lawyer.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to ask a question from my perspective, which is like, if I have to convince like a policymaker in any country or any jurisdiction to adopt something new, so from that perspective, and this may have not been within the scope of the project, but it'd still be good to know whether you were able to establish any sort of either causality or correlation between the success or failure of an outcome-based contract with how well or how poorly a SIB was designed. Because that would, in a sense, if you have good case studies for that, that would be something I'd certainly be very interested in.
Great, thanks. That's a very interesting question, Avik. And believe me, this is something that we will discuss with our group in the Slack chat that we have. But we are at time, so I will pass it on to Shri, who will explain a bit more about the next steps after the Hack and Learn. And then we will close the session. We will stop the recording. There's a social session. Lots of people were invited here to bring something indigo color. And there's a huge debate around what is the indigo color like. But I will stop the recording and then we can hang out for 10 minutes. Yeah, that's it. Shri?
Thank you, Juliana. I'm just going to share something really quickly. So we just have like few next steps here. So I just want to remind that every one of our Slack channels will be open. So if you want to continue working on the challenges or if you want to keep in touch with your teams, feel free to do so. And also we will be writing a blog on the back of this Hack and Learn about the lessons and learnings. So if you're interested to co-author the blog, please let us know or let your challenge leader know. And I think it would be very interesting to kind of reflect on the challenges and then kind of share your learnings. And then last but not least, something that Juliana already mentioned, we have the social session. It's very informal, friendly space. So just hang out. It's the same link. And also, even if you are not wearing anything indigo, that's okay. You can like kind of hang out with us. And we have the next peer learning session that will be in April. We don't have the specific date yet, but be sure to kind of check GoLab website for the information. That's all on my side. Thank you. Back to you, Liana.
Thank you, Shri. Thank you, Shri, and thank you everybody for being here today. And thank you in a very special way to all the participants.